Tactics and Practice podcast.
Bonjour, welcome to The Future Behind Us, a podcast series where I am meeting internationally renowned artists to discuss with them the stories behind works that have become iconic. I will be asking these artists about the technological, the ethical, or even the legal challenges that they have encountered while developing their project. And I will explore in their company how the meaning of their work has changed over these past 5, 10, or 20 years. My name is Regine de Batti. I am a blogger, an art critic, a curator, and my guests in the podcast series are Trevor Paglen, Nora Al-Badri, Hubert Morgan, Gilles Magid, Paolo Pedercini from Molo Industria, Evan Roth, Mediengruppe Bitnik, Sanela Yaich, Pinar Yoldash, and Maya Srekar. In this episode, I am talking with artist Evan Roth. Let's start. For the past almost 20 years, Evan Roth has been creating work through the misuse of tools and materials to empower and to challenge our perceptions of typically unseen aspects of the systems that surround us. I have been following Evan's work for many years now. I was already a fan at the time he co-founded the Graffiti Research Lab together with James Powderly. They worked with graffiti, with open source technology, and with public space. And I was still a fan in 2007 when Roth co-founded the much-missed Free Art and Technology Lab, the FAT Lab, which was a collective of artists, of scientists, musicians, and lawyers who developed works that merged irony, critique, and, again, open source technology. Hello, Evan Roth. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm quite good too. And hello, dear listeners. Today, the podcast is hosting the brilliant Evan Roth. And yes, I really think he's a brilliant artist. Evan, well, really big thank you for participating in this podcast series.
No, thanks so much. Thanks for that really nice introduction. And yeah, we were speaking earlier, but we used to cross paths more often. So it's really nice to be here with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's start in 2016.
Okay.
When you started, I think it was the year you started working on internet landscapes.
Yes.
And it's a series that is documenting the locations where the submarine fiberoptic cables emerge from the oceans and reach the land. And even though most of us never get to see these fiberoptic cables, it's thanks to them and thanks to the fact that they crisscross the seas and the ocean that today we can communicate so easily with people living on other continents. And the series brought you to the beaches of various countries all over the world. And I'm wondering what it was like. For example, I imagine that these coastal sites where the cables reach the land, I imagine them as being isolated, secluded, maybe even protected. So how did you find these locations exactly, and how easy is it to get there, and are they accessible to the public?
Yeah. Okay. I'll answer the accessibility question first, and then I'll double back to your other question about the kind of nature of those landscapes. But the way I would find them is no big secret. I mean, first of all, I started doing this after people like Andrew Blum had written about it. So there was people thinking about the infrastructure of the web at the time when I started this. And I was reading some of those texts and Astra Taylor. And for me, it was a different way of thinking about the web. Like I was looking for a different way to be thinking about it. And so this idea of thinking about it physically was kind of in the air at the time. And so I did one of those trips to go visit the web. And it was actually those earlier trips, I think, were even prior to 2016, like before Landscape sort of officially started as a series. I was experimenting with some other work, but it brought me to those beaches. And I mean, the way to find them is really easy. Like Telegeography publishes the submarine cable map, which is where I usually start. It's a map that marks all these internet fiber optic cable landing locations, and you can zoom in to a certain extent. You can kind of zoom in pretty far. It'll get you to the relative beach. But like you were saying, by design, a lot of these beaches are remote because for obvious reasons, they don't want a lot of people around those cables, whether that's, people that might cause problems. More often, rather than anything malicious, it's just like fishing boats that they want to avoid. And so because they're in small towns, even though that telegeography map doesn't let you zoom all the way into the resolution of finding where that cable is, it puts you pretty close. And so my process, which I expanded over time figuring this out, but like when I knew I was going to a location, I would use the telegeography map to get an initial idea. But then I would spend a lot of time in Google Street View, like just walking around, looking at almost every image that Google would capture in that area. And I would look for clues, like I'd be following manhole covers in the streets, or I would be looking for, there's certain signage that different countries use to signal boats that are looking at the shore where the cable is, so they know not to drop an anchor, for example. Sometimes those signs you can find in Google Street View. But I would basically spend so much time in Google Street View because like I was mentioning earlier, I have kids. And so I didn't want to be on location forever. My time is sort of limited. And so I wanted to maximize the time that I was actually on location filming. And so I would spend a lot of time in the studio figuring out where I wanted to be at certain times of the day. And it didn't mean I would always find exactly where I wanted to be, but usually that time that I spent prior to taking the trip, I felt like it was time well spent. So I have so much visual material from that period because I would do all this research and make these PDFs because I didn't know if I would have internet access when I was doing the filming. And then I would make these giant PDFs with all these screen captures of like things that I thought might be looking interesting from Google Street View, or segments of maps, or like hiking trails. And I would make these PDFs and put them on my phone. And then that would be sort of how I would navigate those landscapes when I was on site. But then, to get back to the first part of your question, even from the very first trip, like I had the experience that I'd read about, which is because they, by design, pick these remote beaches, there is this interesting dichotomy that gets baked into these landscapes if you're thinking about them in relationship to telecommunications or massively connected systems, which is you're maybe going for a set of reasons that has to do with your thinking on those systems. And then you end up in these really isolated moments. And it was from the very beginning that had a big impact on the work and sort of changed the direction of the work a little bit.
You filmed these internet landscapes in Australia and Hong Kong, Cape Town, New York, Buenos Aires, New Zealand, the UK, the US, Sweden, France. I have this list. So how did you select where you would go? Was it completely random, or did you have a map? What was the logic behind it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can kind of answer that by looping back to Aksioma a little bit, who shares some of this history. The very first trip I went to was to Porthcurno, which is Cornwall region in the UK. And that one I picked just because the research that I was doing talks so much about that location, and the history, the colonial history of the British within the history of the network starts from this one location where they had this research center and training ground for cable engineers. It's still today the most, at least at the time I was doing the research, it was the most trafficked in terms of the most data coming from fiber optic cables underground were on those beaches. And so that seemed like a really natural first place to go. Then I got funding from there was a Masters in Servers grant that Aksioma was involved with, even Franco Matas was involved with. I'm sure there was other people. Very early on, had some support from that, which allowed me to sort of pick a location to go to. And so the second one I went to were locations around Sweden. And that was more of like my maybe personal history with the web. Like I was so influenced by Pirate Biren and everything surrounded the Pirate Bay early on in my career. I mean, it's one of the things that sort of led me towards being interested in this kind of work and even led me towards the arts a bit. And so, and I had friends that were in that group and surrounding that group. And so there was a personal connection there too. And so as a second location, Sweden seemed interesting to me to sort of like start my trip into the internet with some sort of reference to Pirate Biren and the Pirate Bay and to something personal, because even I'd always liked how Pirate Biren talked about the peer-to-peer networks as being something that was also small. Like yes, they were doing file sharing at a massive level, but a lot of those groups that were hanging out in IRC, they were not necessarily massive groups. They were maybe more analogous to like what we would think of as like a WhatsApp channel now, like a sort of semi-private public sphere. And they would talk about things like fire being community-oriented technologies where you light something in small groups around them. So I liked a lot of that thinking also. So the fact that there was like a friendship connection there, and I was staying with friends and doing this research on that first trip, that also felt like a sort of interesting way to start that second journey. And then after that, some of it was just logistics in terms of New Zealand was because I got an invitation to give a talk there, and maybe I wouldn't have accepted that otherwise because the flight was so long, but this gave me a flight to get there. And so I was sort of following some of those. But then another really important one, which I need to mention, is I also got funding through Creative Capital in the US and later through Art Angel in the UK. And that funding allowed me to be a little bit more intentional with where I was going, so that I wouldn't always just have to follow where invitations were coming from, which would have left a very different version of the map, because it was important for me to hit some of these locations that aren't where I was getting invitations from, and that did line up also with a lot of the research from that project goes back to that sort of colonial history of the network with the British and with the All Red Line. And so I was looking for places that original Telegraph British network landed, like Cape Town, like Sydney, like Hong Kong. And so that the funding from those organizations allowed me to be a little bit more intentional with where I was going.
Let's go back to the beach, because I was also wondering, how do you frame the scene once you're there and you think you found more or less the location? Like, how do you decide where you will put the camera and what's going to be in the frame?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that work was a little bit of change in working approach for me too. Like, it was thinking about making work on a longer time scale, embracing slowness, and I was learning a lot of these things that became sort of, to me, defining of that project and influenced work I'm making going forward. And so the framing of those shots plays into that. My sort of internal logic for that project was, I mean, it's a research, in my experience in relation to other work, maybe a research heavy project for me, where there was a big research phase. And then there was also this production phase and this field research phase. And what I ended up enjoying about taking that process a bit slowly was I ended up trusting in the research. That's what I sort of learned from doing this project early on. Like, okay, I'm on this beach with this modified camera that's filming in infrared first, and all those has logic behind it for reasons that may or may not resonate with people. Hopefully that does, but internally it resonated for me, right? I had my logic that made sense. Then I could treat that as sort of a foundation to stand on and trust that I'm in the right spot with the right lens. And then that would allow me, when I was there, to let that lens just float. And so I tried to really be intentional about building moments where I was intentionally bringing intuitive moments back into the work, where I didn't want to be on those beaches after doing all that research and that's other kind of work, screen-based work, and then having to really be thinking so logically about where that frame was landing that it took me out of the moment. Like, I wanted to, like, one thing I learned from doing that process is I needed to be in the moment also. Like, even just, it was a part of that process of that work was me being out in the field. I hadn't had that experience where I'm really just out for all day filming and I had to be in the moment. Like, even on those early trips to the UK too, like, I remember if I wasn't in the moment, like, you're just in danger, to be honest. Like, you're on these cliffy trails, and if you're sitting there thinking about what emails you have to answer rather than where my left foot and right foot are going, you can get into trouble. And I did, like, I figured that out pretty quickly. And so I wanted to be in the moment. I wanted to be there. I wanted to be a little bit free with the lens. And also the other thing I learned is if I was, like, things would enter the lens. That was another interesting thing that I wasn't expecting. Is like, I think nature photographers have this experience a lot, but like when you go out into nature and you're still, you almost don't have to point the lens. Like, things will enter the frame, and it happens more often than not. Like, if you really sit with and watch a lot of those pieces, maybe you're just looking at a tree, but something happens. Like, change does exist within these really slow frames. Like, things enter the frame, the sun changes, the wind changes, the cloud's orientation to the sun changes, animals enter the frame, drones enter the frame, people enter the frame. And so I liked those moments. I learned from those moments. And now that I'm working on other series, I try to do the same approach where, like, I try to have trust in the research phase of my work that builds moments for me to be more intuitive and free and gestural, and that I can feel that freedom a little bit, because it's not natural to me. Like, I come from, my undergraduate was in architecture, and even my master's of fine arts degree was like based in kind of design and technology. So I come from this more structured world. So for me, kind of like tapping into these more intuitive moments isn't as natural. And so for me, having this like research grounding actually helps that rather than hindering it. It's something I try to work with students as well.
That's really interesting. I would like to talk with you about red lines, because it's connected to internet landscapes. So it's still about the same cable landing location, but red lines took the form of peer-to-peer network performance that enable people over the course of 2 years to connect to this red lines network and watch some of the videos of the internet landscape series. And people could live with the work at home or at the office or wherever they want, as long as they had a spare screen and an internet connection. Now, what I'm curious about is the way that you allowed people to share, or maybe not share so much that space, because the participants could be, as I say, located everywhere in the world. But what I think was quite moving is that they were connected over distance and they were all looking at the same view. One could say that Red Lines offered them a shared and connected space, but it was not Facebook. So they could not message each other. They could not like a view. So it was not your typical 21st century social experience. So I'm wondering why you did not add an extra layer of sociability and why you decided that participants in this network performance would have only limited means to, or almost no means to interact with each other.
Yeah. I mean, your question hits really close to sort of the heart of that project where, I mean, that Red Lines project, that really came directly from that Art Angel funding period. And that, I mean, again, talking about intentionality, like I never had that experience where I was working with like a team and, a project producer, Charmaine Griffin, who was amazing. And so we were really thinking a lot about media and like medium and what is the appropriate medium for this. And again, going back to that sort of peer-to-peer and initial inspiration of the web, like peer-to-peer networks were such a big part of me having change in my own thinking and being excited to make work and shifting from architecture to doing something different. And so having the medium of that performance be peer-to-peer was really important. And I wouldn't even have been able to tackle that without having support. Like I don't know how to build a peer-to-peer network. And so that was kind of the thinking behind why it became a peer-to-peer network. But then those decisions that you're alluding to, yeah, you're right. And those were definitely very intentional. Like it didn't want it to turn into this system of sort of like user engagement and liking and all this. And it wasn't that I didn't want user engagement, but I was just looking for a way of thinking about smaller communities, smaller audiences, but meaningful experiences. I was thinking a lot about radio too, and like the history of radio and even my own personal history with radio, where I think a lot of people have this experience where like there's something about listening to radio where even though you're not in direct contact with people, I mean, maybe you are like, but you could message them, for example, but there's this sort of like shared but alone moment that I have with radio. I think a lot of people have with radio that feels meaningful. Like you're enjoying this one experience of listening to music or listening to somebody talk, but the fact that other people are there is context for that. And you feel that somehow. And you feel it directly, like when you're driving, you hear somebody listening to maybe the same radio station you are, and you have this really amazing shared moment with like one person, And so I wanted this Red Lines performance to sort of have that feeling where you weren't alone, but your access to other people was at a distance. And I wanted it to be something that you maybe more felt through the work rather than had direct access to. And the other side of it too is I was really interested in people living with this work. And so it's not that I wasn't interested with people finding it in exhibition spaces, but I always kind of viewed the public exhibition of that work almost as, in one way, like an educational element to learning about the work, and that the work sort of completes when you go home and you live with it over an extended period of time. And to me, I don't know, the idea of living with this work that's not just this file that's looping, but that is you become part of the infrastructure. You're uploading, you're downloading, and these other people that are watching it are also the infrastructure too. There's something empowering about that to me, right? That we can create our own networks. It's not that the tools are so complicated or that the hardware is so expensive that we can't build our own infrastructure. And so that was, for me, I'm really thankful that I had the support that enabled that to happen, because for me, that was really, I don't know, it was kind of, to me, the appropriate way, a fitting way for that network to exist.
Yeah, talking about the appropriate way, one thing I found interesting about Red Lines is, I don't know if I can call it distribution, but it's a series that has been compared to romantic paintings. It's been called meditative. In a sense, in so many ways, it's the opposite of TikTok. And it's also visually stunning. And even the concept behind it is fascinating, because it's about this materiality of digital information that we never consider. And yeah, my curiosity is, why did you decide that anyone could enjoy the work at home and for free during 2 years? And I get that you were paid because it was a commission, but why did you not instead sell the videos on the art market? Why do you over the course of 2 years, offer this possibility of everyone to enjoy it for free?
Sure. And one way to answer that is like, that's just sort of where it came from. That was sort of my path, was like coming through the free culture movement, free software movement, open source movement, whatever you want to call that. It's especially poignant sort of in those early 2000s. It was kind of foundational for me. Like I learned so much from that community, and I've talked to people in that scene before, and they talk about obligation in a very positive way, that like part of the reason to give back is obligation, which I always sort of liked that answer when other people gave it. But so I do feel like obliged to be sharing because I got so much from people that shared. But also, I just feel like net art has always been a really big influence in my work. Obviously, net art is still happening, but there was a really exciting period for net art that was when I was making some of this work, more solo work than the collaborative work. And a lot of it had that same ethos too, that this was all, there was something exciting that you could have this primary experience with an artwork, not a mediated version, not the poster of it, not a JPEG of it, but you could have this primary experience of the artwork for free in your browser. And that scene is still very exciting to me. But I felt like one aspect of net art that maybe hadn't been explored as much was that another advantage of net art is there's this opportunity to live with work that most people don't have, because artwork is exceedingly expensive. It's like a luxury good, right? Like most people don't have the experience of living with art. And I had that experience with my own work. It's part of my art making process. I've talked about this before, but I like to live with my work before I exhibit it publicly, because I really think you learn so much about work, and you learn about it in a different way that's less intellectual and more, I don't know, it's not to dismiss the intellectual side of understanding an art piece, but there is also something you just come to embody it. It accesses a different part of your brain, like a background processes when you wake up to it every day. And I think for me, it made things much more clear in terms of understanding that component of work really opened up a different way of thinking about artwork for me that influences the way I make art. And so I felt like net art also had this advantage that people could be having this primary experience of artwork, but not be having it something that's surfed to and away from. Like so much of net art was about this surfing, which is beautiful, but it's also very fast. I was going to say ephemeral, but Redlines is also ephemeral, but it's a slower ephemerality. And so the idea of giving it away for free. So part of it was just, I like giving things away for free. I like taking things for free digitally. It feels like it's natural kind of state. But I thought one way that I was thinking about Redlines is, even if people didn't like the project, didn't like it aesthetically, it was an invitation for a lot of people to live with work that I think maybe it was an invitation for many people for the first time to live with an art piece. And so the work that, especially the Redlines component of it, a lot of the sort of outreach we were trying to do. It's a funny conversation to have with an institution, because I remember having these conversations with Art Angel, and they were investing, for me, it felt like a lot of infrastructure, a lot of money into the project. And then to try to convince them, we had these conversations, we're like, okay, anything publicly we do is going to take away from this primary experience people could have from home. So like, how do we share this project? How do we sort of get the word out about it without making some exhibition that's just going to, whatever we would exhibit, I knew would take all the attention. It would take all the visual attention, all the imagery would be about the installation. And so we made a lot of effort, and they made a lot of sacrifices. I mean, that's the wrong word, but like they could have made a lot more noise about that project had we had one of those moments. But I thought it was really cool of them to go down this path with me, where we really tried to push very hard this idea of it being something people live with at home. It's okay if the audience is very small, but the hope was that even if the audience was smaller, that it would be longer, it would be slower. And the statistics from like how you can get like server statistics and see kind of what user engagement stuff is. They sent that to me after the project was over, and it was like the most bizarre web statistics I've seen, because the numbers it wasn't like it had, 1 billion YouTube views like you see, but I forget what the number is. I think I wrote it somewhere online, but it's like the average amount of time each user spent on the site was something like 20 hours or something. It was like really long, And so in that sense, that was kind of one of the goals, was to like have this experience that could be slower, that could unfold over a longer period of time. And that could happen in the home.
Yeah, I like what you said. You wanted an experience of slow ephemerality, because I remember how I engaged with the work where, I would spend long time without paying attention to it. And then suddenly I would feel the need, I'm going to have these internet landscapes somewhere on the screen. And then after the 2 years, I realized how privileged I had been, because suddenly the option was not there anymore. Yeah, I have one last curiosity about this internet landscape is whether or not you see parallels between the way the material infrastructure of the internet is invisibilized and buried underground, as in the case of the cables, so we are locked inside data centers that no one can access. So on the one hand, there's this invisibility, and on the other hand, there is the sometimes dark ways in which the internet operates on a more socio-political level. And by that, I mean the fact we do not fully understand how algorithms take decision and at what precise point. We do not perceive the existence of the humans who are tagging images for artificial intelligence. We don't have any clear idea of the amount of energy and water that is necessary to use ChatGPT and daily. So do you see parallels? Was this work on internet cables a way to address these dark ways that the internet operates?
Yeah, and that line of thinking was very present, especially when I started it. Like back in that sort of 2016, 2017 era, I was thinking about that a lot. You brought this up when we were talking earlier that this is maybe a positive that things have changed, but like now I think people do have a much better conception that the web is something different. And part of that is the data centers that you just see, right? Like I go visit family who lives in Virginia and you can't avoid it anymore. You see it when you drive down the highway. But back then it was, yeah, we're thinking about that quite a bit, that people were realizing that the kind of metaphor we'd been sold of the cloud was a very poor one. Like Astra Taylor wrote about this directly. I loved her book. And so if it's a poor metaphor, then what are some more appropriate images that we could associate in our brains with that network? And so I was thinking about in the beginning, and then another part of working on something slower for me, like not kind of moving from project to project, but I think I was working on this for longer than 5 years. I'd have to look up exactly, but like over the course of that time, some of that thinking I could move away from a little bit. And even though the work maybe didn't change drastically, like some of the ways I was thinking about the work shifted a bit. And so I almost felt like I could leave. I felt like that part of the conversation I had thought about in the beginning, but towards the end of it, I was thinking about maybe different things, thinking about how landscape was depicted, how the work I'm making connects to the history of how landscape was depicted, how things that are in our environment are the environment, whether or not we can see them or not. You know, they're part of the environment. And what's a way to sort of depict that duality of a landscape in sort of one gesture? So those were kind of where I was more at the end of the project.
Yeah, I think I would have so many other questions about the internet landscape, but I would like to briefly talk about what you were doing with the Fat Lab team.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a personal reason for that, is that Fat Lab will always have a place in my memory as an art lover and as an internet user because of several of the works you developed that were opening up my eyes on what it meant for these tech information corporations to have so much power and who they answer to and the kind of impact it has on our lives and all kinds of discourses that today are obvious to everyone. But I remember when, for example, Fat Lab was targeting Google with a series of fuck Google interventions. It was a time where, it sounds strange to say it today, but Google was cool at the time.
Yeah. It's really different times. Yeah. I mean, back then too, when we started that was back when part of Google's branding was don't be evil. That was one of their like taglines. I mean, it was how much things have changed is so different. But you mentioned this when we were talking earlier that yes, this is a very positive thing. That's a sign that there has been some positive change in that discourse. So I like looking back on that aspect and thinking that things have maybe gotten a bit brighter.
But do you think that you would still, if Fat Lab was still operating today, do you think you would still target Google the way you did at the time? Because I keep reading articles in newspapers saying that, Google is a bit over. And then nowadays, if people want some information, they check Facebook, if they are of a certain generation, or they check TikTok, and even researchers, employees, students, they turn to ChatGPT. I recently heard in France that students cannot imagine living without ChatGPT. So it went really, really fast.
Yeah.
So it seems that there are new reference when we look for information and answer. So do you think that FAT would still target Google today? Or do you think there are more threatening companies in the world of digital information? And also, does it really matter whether they are called Google or whether they are called TikTok or DALL-E or ChatGPT?
It's a really good question. To be honest, it's hard for me to answer because it's hard for me to picture what Fat Lab would be doing right now. I mean, one thing is always follow the money, right? Like, who is the one that's benefiting the most off of this right now? I think Google's still up there. I think there's definitely other things to be critical of. I mean, the other thing too is like the way we were operating within that group wasn't always so, it wasn't like we were sitting down and having these group meetings about and like, okay, who's the most important person that we should be targeting right now? I don't know. It wasn't quite that formulated. A lot of the projects that came up were people would just get interested in something and following a thread, and some other people would jump in on it. And so I'm not sure where that would be going now. And to go back to the group, when we started splitting up, this is related to that also, is because there was the moment when we were talking about Google, we were talking about other issues, when we felt like as a group that we were on top of that discourse. Mm-hmm. And then there was so much that was happening. We were also starting to get older. People were getting families and jobs and had other things pulling them away from being able to just be making projects all the time. And I think there was this feeling that we started to not even know, like, okay, where should we go? How do we jump into that now? I don't know. It felt really sort of intimidating almost, to like, okay, we did all this and now how are we going to jump fully into this other thing now, when maybe when we were running so fast to try to keep pace with how things were changing on the web, once you slow down a little bit, you know, it's like an exponential curve. The web just takes off and it felt almost impossible to sort of catch back up. Part of the reason is maybe it's hard for me to answer that question now is like, I still maybe feel like I'm playing catch up with where to tackle things now. And it also just feels so different. I mean, people are doing scientific studies now on the impact psychologically of social media networks. We have like more empirical data that this isn't just a feeling that some of this might be a negative effect. Like we have actual data we can point to that's saying we're being affected negatively by some of these things. And so, yeah, I don't know. We should have a reunion and see where people decide what to attack now.
Oh, wow. Is it why you turned to painting? Because while preparing the podcast, obviously I had a look at your website and I found about what you're working on now, which is called Strands. Mm-hmm. And it's a series of paintings that you paint with your little hands, if I understood correctly. And the series examine maps as an example of systems that we tend to see as being factual and neutral, but are actually coming with many biases connected to historic power structure. So that's the background. Mm-hmm. And my question is, I find it so interesting that someone, well, you used to work a lot with graffiti, but I've always associated you with digital technologies. And suddenly I find this work where you do some hand painting. Mm-hmm, where does that come from?
Okay, I'll answer that, and I'll try to connect the dots between fat and landscapes to get to painting, because it looks totally different. But the way I think about it being connected is that as Fat Lab was sort of closing down, and I was being self-critical, let's say, about the work I was making, as I think it's healthy, right? To sort of think how we can maybe grow in the work that we're making or how we're making work. And Fat Lab was so much about experimenting with speed, like speed as a way of keeping pace with culture and as a way with hopefully injecting activist ideals within this larger network. And I was so caught up in that speed metric, which I think media arts gets caught up in sometimes also, you know, like always feeling like they need to tackle this new thing immediately. And I started thinking about, okay, well, what if I started experimenting with the opposite of that? Which at the time I was thinking was the opposite, but then now I think about as more of being something that's relational rather than opposite. This is something that came from this book, Slow Art by Arden Reed, where he talks about how speed and slowness, they're not oppositional, they're relational. Like you need to understand one to understand the other. And if you have dabbled in speed, then you're in a good position to also experiment with slowness, right? If you know how speed functions, then you might be in a good position to be experimenting with how slowness functions. And so that was one thing I was really interested in. And that kind of makes that transition between Fat Lab and some of the landscapes work I was doing maybe a little bit more evident, that like it was maybe looks totally different and the experience of it was maybe very different. But this relational kind of aspect between speed and slowness was a big part of that. Yeah. And so anyway, he also goes on in the book to talk about how art was always slow prior to whatever, the camera or the computer, right? If we wanted to make an image, we had to sit down and undergo this very slow process of reproducing it by hand and whatever we're drawing
and
or
making
painting.
Your pigments.
Exactly. Like all this thing. Yeah, exactly. Making pigments and finding surfaces to put that pigment on. Like all of this was a very, very slow process. And so that art has historically been this very slow process. And so I was thinking about all these things, and I was thinking that kind of put the idea of painting in my head early on. It's like, okay, painting, that seems like a very interesting, slow process. So I knew I wanted to do something with painting. And then also towards the tail end of the landscape series, like I was really getting interested in thinking about how ideology becomes embedded in these landscapes and these images, these renderings of these landscapes, right? And how with landscape-based imagery, it initially feels kind of coded, right? Like you're just looking at this maybe image that maybe looks very simple, looks very unthreatening, like a sky and a horizon line and the land. But I got really fascinated with how it can be very dangerous, these depictions, and it can really quickly lead to nationalism and be talking about exploitation and labor practices and all these other things. But it's coded and it's hidden, which is interesting to me. But that led me to thinking about cartography and how in cartography, who's at the center is immediately right away, right? Who is at the top of the map? Who's at the bottom of the map? As the map distorts, who benefits from those distortions? Who's minimized by those distortions? And so that kind of got me interested in thinking about cartography as a way of talking about some of the same things I was interested in talking about with landscapes, but maybe in a more visibly direct way. And so the Strand series was really a combination of those two things, like thinking about slowness and getting interested in painting as a slow process, and then also getting interested in cartography and the history of cartography as a way of visualizing biases within systems.
Well, I'm really glad that I had this conversation with you, because sometimes I have the feeling that you had several lives. You know, you had the graffiti research lab, you had FAT lab, you have these internet landscape, network performances, and now you do paintings, and it looked like, you know, different Evan. And then now I think I connect the dot much better. So
okay, I like that. And even the Strands painting process, it's still based in free software. Like at the core of it is a piece of free software that I developed with Cesar Mocan, who's an artist and developer. And so even that, it looks very different. The process is very different, but still at the core of that is a piece of open source software that people can go use for free.
Okay, well, I like this way to end our discussion. So thank you so much for your time, Evan.
Thanks so much. It's really good to talk with you.
I'm happy we had this opportunity to catch up. If you're not familiar with Evan's work, check out his website. The address is evan-roth.com. You will find the exact link in the show notes. And Evan apparently reads a lot, so we'll also add the references to the books he mentioned. So thank you, merci, and talk to you soon. Au revoir.
Thanks so much. Bye.
That's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. The Future Behind Us is a podcast series conceived and conducted by me, Régine Debatty, for the 25th edition of the Pixel Point Festival curated by Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art as part of Go 2025 Nova Gorica Gorizia, European Capital of Culture. Thank you to Yanis fucking Yansha for the invitation to take on this challenge and for his precious collaboration and assistance in the curatorial process. Thank you also to Marcela Okritic for the impeccable coordination. The editing, the music, and the audio post-production are all by Gasper Torkar. Next week, I will be joined by artists Carmen Weisskopf and Domagoj Smolju from Mediengruppe Bitnik to talk about services offered on the darknet, police confiscating your exhibition, and a school of social autonomy. All episodes are available at aksioma.org/podcast, on the website of the Pixel Point Festival, and on all major podcast platforms by typing Tactics and Practice in the search bar. For more information on the context, the participants, and the partners involved, see the link in the description. That's it for now. Bye everyone. Au revoir.
Tactics and Practice Podcast.